The sound of laughter died the moment Michael Torres stepped into that uniform for the first time. What had once been a sanctuary of jokes, pranks, and brotherhood suddenly felt like a courtroom where he was both judge and defendant. The same men who had shared their deepest fears with him over late-night training sessions now stood at attention, their eyes avoiding his. The transformation wasn't just in the fabric he wore or the rank on his shoulders, it was in the invisible wall that had risen between him and the only family he'd ever truly known. Some stories begin with a single moment that changes everything. This isn't one of those stories. This is about the 1,000 small moments that led to that uniform, and the 1,000 more that followed, each one teaching Michael that leadership isn't about earning respect, but about learning when to demand it, when to give it, and when to step back and let others find their own way to it. In a world where hierarchy can make or break relationships, where orders can shatter friendships, and where the line between authority and humanity grows thinner each day, Michael's journey from squad member to commanding officer would test everything he thought he knew about loyalty, friendship, and what it truly means to lead. Michael Torres had always been the guy everyone wanted on their team. Not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he had this natural way of making everyone around him better. In the military training facility where he'd spent the last 3 years, that quality had earned him something more valuable than medals or commendations. It had earned him brothers. The locker room was their unofficial headquarters, a place where ranks meant nothing and jokes flew as freely as the steam from the showers. It was here that Danny Martinez would practice his terrible impressions of their drill instructors, making everyone laugh until their sides hurt. Here where Jake Williams would share photos from home, talking about his little sister's soccer games with the pride of a father. And here where Michael would listen to it all, offering advice when asked, staying quiet when needed, but always present, always steady. "Torres, you're gonna be leading us all someday," Danny had said one evening as they were getting ready for inspection. It was meant as a compliment, but something in Michael's chest tightened at the words. He'd laughed it off then, tossing a towel at Danny's head and telling him to focus on shining his own boots properly. But the truth was, Michael had already started noticing things. The way Sergeant Collins looked at him during briefings, as if measuring something invisible. The way Captain Rodriguez had started asking for his input during planning sessions, even though his rank didn't technically require it. The way his fellow soldiers naturally turned to him when problems arose, even when their official squad leader was standing right there. The signs were all there, but Michael pushed them aside. This brotherhood they'd built was too precious to risk. These men weren't just his colleagues, they were his family in every way that mattered. Danny, with his quick wit and quicker temper, who'd once gotten into a fight defending Michael's reputation when he wasn't even there to witness it. Jake, whose quiet thoughtfulness masked a fierce loyalty that ran deeper than blood. Marcus Thompson, whose technical skills were matched only by his ability to find humor in the darkest moments. And Alex Rodriguez, whose natural leadership abilities made everyone wonder why he wasn't the one being considered for promotion. They had developed their own language of inside jokes and shared experiences. Late-night conversations that ranged from philosophical debates about duty and honor to ridiculous arguments about which superhero would make the best soldier. Weekend liberty spent exploring whatever town they were stationed near, always as a group, always watching each other's backs. They'd been through basic training together, advanced courses together, and now they were facing the possibility of their first deployment together. The dynamic was perfect, or so Michael thought. He was the glue that held them together without being the official leader. He could mediate when Danny and Marcus butted heads over procedures. He could draw Jake out of his shell when homesickness threatened to overwhelm him. He could channel Alex's leadership instincts in directions that complemented rather than competed with their official chain of command. But perfection, Michael was beginning to learn, was often just a moment of calm before everything changed. The first crack in their brotherhood came during a routine training exercise. Their squad leader, Corporal Peterson, had made a tactical error that put half the unit in a compromised position. Michael saw it happening and faced a choice that would haunt him for weeks afterward. He could follow orders and watch potential disaster unfold, or he could speak up and undermine Peterson's authority in front of the entire squad. He chose to speak up. "Peterson, if we advance on that position now, we'll be sitting ducks for the sniper nest on the ridge," Michael called out, his voice cutting through the chaos of the mock battle. The exercise stopped. Every eye turned to him, then to Peterson, then back again. The silence stretched until Peterson, his face red with embarrassment and anger, gave the order to adjust their approach. It was the right call. Michael's intervention likely prevented what would have been scored as significant casualties in the exercise. But, in that moment, something fundamental shifted. After the exercise, Peterson pulled Michael aside. "You were right," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "But, next time, you find a way to tell me privately. Undermining authority in front of the troops, even when you're right, sets a dangerous precedent." Michael nodded, but inside he was wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. What if there hadn't been time for a private conversation? What if lives had been at stake? What if being right wasn't enough if you couldn't act on it? His friend's reactions were equally complicated. Danny clapped him on the back, grinning. "Man, the look on Peterson's face when you called that out. Priceless." But Jake seemed more thoughtful, his expression troubled. "You put Peterson in a really tough spot," he said quietly later. "I mean, you were right, but..." The but hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Being right wasn't the same as being diplomatic. Being capable wasn't the same as being wise. And, sometimes, the very qualities that made someone good at their job could make them difficult to work with. Captain Rodriguez summoned Michael to his office the next morning. The captain was a career military man who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. His office was sparse but organized, every item serving a purpose, much like the man himself. "Sit down, Torres," Rodriguez said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I want to talk to you about yesterday." Michael sat, his back straight, waiting for either praise or reprimand. What he got was something more complex. "You showed good tactical thinking out there," Rodriguez began. "You also showed poor understanding of chain of command. That combination tells me something important about where you are in your development as a soldier." He paused, studying Michael's face. "You're ready for more responsibility than you currently have, but you're not ready for the responsibility that comes with that responsibility. Do you understand the difference?" Michael thought he did, but, he said, "I'm not sure, sir." "The responsibility of leadership isn't just about making the right decisions," Rodriguez explained. "It's about making those decisions in ways that preserve the integrity of the system that allows those decisions to matter. Peterson made a mistake yesterday. You corrected it. But, in doing so, you created a bigger problem. You undermined the chain of command in front of junior personnel." The captain leaned forward. "I'm not criticizing your judgment, Torres. I'm criticizing your method. A good leader finds ways to be right without making others wrong. A great leader finds ways to be right while making others better." As Michael left the captain's office, his mind was spinning. Everything he thought he understood about leadership was being challenged. He'd always believed that doing the right thing was enough, that competence would speak for itself, that good intentions could overcome poor execution. The walk back to the barracks felt longer than usual. His fellow soldiers greeted him normally, but Michael found himself analyzing every interaction differently. When Danny made a joke about the previous day's exercise, was he really just joking, or was there an edge there? When Jake asked about his meeting with the captain, was it genuine concern or something else? That evening in the locker room, the usual easy camaraderie felt forced. Conversations that should have flowed naturally seemed to hit invisible barriers. Michael caught Alex watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read: assessment, maybe, or concern, or something else entirely. "You okay, man?" Marcus asked as they were getting ready for evening formation. "You seem... I don't know. Different." Michael forced a smile. "Just thinking about some stuff," Rodriguez said. "Nothing major." But it was major, and they all knew it. The equilibrium they'd maintained for 3 years was shifting, and none of them knew exactly how to navigate the change. Michael was still their friend, still their teammate, but something indefinable had altered. He was being evaluated for something they weren't, being prepared for something they might not be part of. The realization hit him as he stood in formation that evening, listening to the standard announcements and briefings. Leadership wasn't just about being better at the job, it was about being separated from the people you cared about most. It was about having to make decisions that affected your friends' lives while maintaining the professional distance necessary to make those decisions objectively. As the formation dismissed and they headed back to their quarters, Michael found himself walking slightly apart from the group for the first time in 3 years. Not because he wanted to, but because he suddenly understood that the path he was being offered would require it. Danny noticed and fell back to walk beside him. "Hey, whatever's going on in that head of yours, don't let it mess with what we have here," he said, his usual joking tone replaced by something more serious. "We're brothers, Torres. That doesn't change just because some captain thinks you're leadership material." Michael nodded, but even as he did, he wondered if Danny was right. Could brotherhood survive the transition to leadership? Could friendship withstand the weight of authority? And, if it couldn't, was the price worth paying? That night, as he lay in his bunk listening to the familiar sounds of his squadmates settling in for the night, Danny's quiet humming, Jake's barely audible phone call home, Marcus flipping through a technical manual, Michael realized that everything was about to change. The only question was whether he would have any say in how it happened. 3 weeks after his conversation with Captain Rodriguez, Michael received orders that changed everything. He was being transferred to officer candidate school not immediately, but in 6 months, after he completed specialized leadership training with his current unit. The news should have felt like a victory, but instead it felt like watching a slow-motion collision he was powerless to prevent. The official announcement came during morning formation. Colonel Williams, the base commander, read through a list of personnel changes with the same monotone he used for weather reports. When he reached Michael's name, there was a slight pause, a glance in his direction, and then, the words that would define the next phase of his military career: Specialist Torres has been selected for advanced leadership development and subsequent officer training. Congratulations, Specialist. The formation dissolved into the usual post-announcement chatter, but Michael felt frozen in place. Around him, his friends were reacting with the kind of mixed emotions that come when good news for one person means uncertainty for everyone else. "Holy shit, Torres." Danny was the first to break through the awkwardness, grabbing Michael's arm with genuine excitement. "Officer training. You're gonna be a real brass hat." But even Danny's enthusiasm couldn't mask the underlying tension. Jake's congratulations were warm but subdued. Marcus asked practical questions about timing and logistics that felt like he was trying to calculate exactly when their group dynamic would change forever. And Alex just nodded with a complicated expression that might have been pride or resignation or something in between. The next few days brought a flood of new responsibilities. Michael was assigned to work directly with Lieutenant Patterson, the unit's executive officer, on training scenarios and personnel evaluations. It was valuable experience, but it also meant spending less time with his squad and more time in briefing rooms and planning sessions. Lieutenant Patterson was a good teacher, patient and thorough, but he also had a way of making Michael see his former perspective from an entirely different angle. During their first one-on-one session, Patterson spread out a series of personnel files across his desk. "I want you to evaluate these soldiers for a hypothetical deployment," Patterson said. "Tell me who you'd want in your unit and why." Michael studied the files carefully. Some contained names he recognized, good soldiers with solid records. Others were strangers, just statistics and performance ratings on paper. He made his selections based on skills, experience, and reliability, explaining his reasoning as he went. Patterson listened without comment until Michael finished, then asked a question that stopped him cold: "What about your current squadmates? Where do they fit in your assessment?" It was then that Michael realized none of his friends' files were among those he'd been given to review. Patterson had deliberately excluded them, forcing Michael to think about personnel decisions without the complication of personal relationships. "That's the challenge you're going to face," Patterson explained. "Every decision you make as a leader will affect people you care about. Sometimes those decisions will benefit them. Sometimes they won't. And sometimes you'll have to make choices that are right for the mission but hard on the people you consider family." The lesson was abstract, but it became concrete sooner than Michael expected. 2 weeks into his leadership training, their unit received orders for a 3-month deployment to a remote training facility. It was a routine assignment, but it would involve specialized roles that required careful personnel selection. Captain Rodriguez called Michael into his office to discuss the deployment roster. "I want your input on squad assignments," Rodriguez said, sliding a preliminary list across his desk. "You know these men better than anyone. Tell me if you see any problems with these groupings." Michael scanned the list and immediately spotted an issue. Danny and Marcus were assigned to the same squad, along with 2 other soldiers known for their short tempers. It was a recipe for conflict that could undermine the entire mission's effectiveness. "Sir, I think Martinez and Thompson might work better in separate squads," Michael said carefully. "They're both strong soldiers, but they tend to clash when they're grouped together for extended periods." Rodriguez nodded. "I had the same concern. What would you recommend?" Michael studied the roster, weighing personalities, skills, and unit dynamics. His recommendations would determine not just who worked with whom, but who would have the best opportunities for advancement, who would face the greatest challenges, and, ultimately, who would benefit most from the deployment experience. As he made his suggestions, Michael realized he was making decisions about his friends' careers without consulting them, based on information and perspectives they weren't privy to. It felt like a betrayal, even though he knew it was necessary. The hardest part came when Rodriguez asked about Jake. "Williams has been struggling with confidence issues lately," the captain noted. "Do you think he'd benefit from a leadership role on this deployment, or would it be better to give him more time to develop?" Michael thought about Jake's quiet competence, his tendency to second-guess himself, his fierce loyalty to the team. A leadership position could boost his confidence and advance his career. It could also expose weaknesses that might damage his standing with his peers. "He's ready for more responsibility," Michael said finally. "But maybe not formal leadership yet. Could we put him in a position where he'd be mentoring newer soldiers? That might give him the confidence boost without the pressure of command authority." Rodriguez made a note on the roster. "Good thinking. That's exactly the kind of nuanced understanding we need from our future officers." As Michael left the captain's office, he felt the weight of what he'd just done. He'd analyzed his best friend like a piece of equipment, weighing his strengths and weaknesses for optimal deployment. It was the right approach for a leader, but it felt wrong for a friend. The roster was announced the following Monday. Michael watched his friends' faces as they learned their assignments, knowing he'd played a role in determining their fates. Danny seemed pleased with his placement. Marcus accepted his assignment with his usual professionalism. But Jake's reaction was harder to read, a mixture of gratitude for the mentoring role and something that might have been disappointment at not receiving full leadership responsibilities. After the announcement, Alex approached Michael privately. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone carefully neutral. They walked to a quiet corner of the training yard, away from the clusters of soldiers discussing their new assignments. "Did Rodriguez ask for your input on the roster?" Alex asked. Michael hesitated. The question wasn't accusatory, but it carried implications he wasn't sure how to handle. Lying would damage their friendship, but the truth might damage their unit dynamics. "He asked for my opinion on some of the assignments," Michael said carefully. Alex nodded slowly. "That's what I figured. Look, I'm not upset about it. You know us better than anyone, and if you're going to be a leader, this is the kind of thing you'll have to do. I just wanted to make sure we both understood what was happening here." There was a weight to Alex's words that went beyond the immediate situation. He was acknowledging the change in their relationship, accepting it, but also making clear that he understood the implications. "It doesn't change anything between us," Michael said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't entirely true. "It changes everything," Alex replied, not unkindly. "But that's okay. We all knew this day would come eventually. You're good at this stuff, Torres. Better than the rest of us, probably better than you realize. Just remember who your friends are when you're making these decisions." That evening, the usual locker room gathering felt different. The easy familiarity was still there, but underneath it was a new awareness of hierarchy and position. When Danny made jokes about their upcoming deployment, Michael found himself thinking about operational security. When Marcus complained about equipment assignments, Michael caught himself evaluating the validity of the complaint rather than simply commiserating. Jake seemed to sense the change most acutely. During a quiet moment while the others were engaged in their usual banter, he approached Michael with a question that cut straight to the heart of the issue. "Are you still one of us?" he asked simply. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with years of shared experience and an uncertain future. Michael wanted to answer immediately, to reassure his friend that nothing fundamental had changed, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was complicated. He was still their friend, still cared about them deeply, still wanted what was best for each of them. But he was also beginning to see them through different eyes, to understand their strengths and weaknesses in ways that would influence decisions they might never know he was making. "I'm still me," Michael said finally. "But I'm also becoming something else. I don't know yet what that means for all of us." Jake nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from genuine friendship. "Just don't forget where you came from when you get where you're going." The deployment preparations continued over the following weeks, and, with each passing day, Michael felt the subtle shift in his relationships becoming more pronounced. His friends still included him in their conversations and activities, but there was a new filter to their interactions. Casual complaints about leadership became more measured when he was around. Discussions about future plans seemed to acknowledge that his path was diverging from theirs. The most painful moment came during their last weekend before deployment. The five of them had planned a night out, their traditional pre-deployment celebration. But, during dinner, Danny made an offhand comment about kissing up to the brass, and, while it wasn't directed at Michael, the silence that followed made it clear that everyone was thinking about his recent proximity to the officer corps. "Sorry, man," Danny said quickly. "That wasn't aimed at you." "I know," Michael replied, but the moment crystallized something he'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. His friends were beginning to see him differently, not just as someone preparing for leadership, but as someone who was already separate from them in ways that mattered. The evening continued, but the easy camaraderie they'd always shared felt forced, like actors playing roles they'd outgrown. They were still friends, still cared about each other, but they were also beginning to prepare for a future where those friendships would be complicated by rank, responsibility, and the inevitable distance that comes with authority. As they walked back to base that night, Michael found himself slightly ahead of the group again, not by choice but by some unconscious adjustment in their formation. Behind him, he could hear his friends talking and laughing, but he was no longer fully part of the conversation. Lieutenant Patterson's words echoed in his mind: "Every decision you make as a leader will affect people you care about." What Patterson hadn't mentioned was that preparing to make those decisions would change the relationships themselves, that the weight of future responsibility would alter present dynamics in ways that couldn't be undone. Looking back at his friends, Michael realized that this deployment would be more than just a training exercise. It would be the first real test of whether the bonds they'd forged as equals could survive the transformation of one of them into something different, something more, but also something necessarily apart. The deployment to Camp Meridian began exactly as Michael had expected, with careful distance and professional courtesy from his friends. What he hadn't expected was how quickly that distance would become necessary rather than awkward. The remote training facility was designed to simulate forward operating conditions, complete with limited resources, communication blackouts, and scenarios that tested both individual skills and unit cohesion. For the first week, Michael continued his leadership training under Lieutenant Patterson while his friends settled into their assigned roles. Danny thrived in his new squad, his natural charisma quickly making him popular with soldiers who didn't know him well enough to be annoyed by his constant jokes. Marcus excelled at his technical assignments, earning praise from senior NCOs who rarely gave compliments. Jake, as Michael had hoped, found confidence in his mentoring role, helping newer soldiers adapt to the challenging environment. Alex, however, was struggling. It started with small things: missed deadlines on routine reports, equipment that wasn't properly maintained, a general sense that his attention was elsewhere. Lieutenant Patterson noticed it first and mentioned it to Michael during one of their weekly reviews. "Rodriguez is a good soldier," Patterson said, reviewing performance reports. But, he seems distracted lately. Any insight into what might be affecting his focus? Michael knew exactly what was affecting Alex's focus. His friend was dealing with the realization that despite his natural leadership abilities, he hadn't been selected for officer training. Instead, he was watching his peer, his friend, receive opportunities that he believed he deserved equally. He's probably adjusting to the new environment, Michael said diplomatically. Alex has always been someone who needs time to process changes. Patterson studied him for a moment. Torres, I'm going to give you some advice that might save you years of leadership mistakes. When you know something is affecting a soldier's performance, and you have the relationship and insight to help address it, staying diplomatically neutral isn't kindness, it's negligence. The words hit harder than Michael expected. Patterson was right, but talking to Alex about his performance issues would require acknowledging the elephant that had been growing between them for months. That evening, Michael found Alex alone in the communications tent, ostensibly checking equipment but clearly just needing space away from the others. The conversation that followed would fundamentally change their friendship. Want to talk about what's going on? Michael asked, settling onto a crate across from Alex. Alex didn't look up from the radio he was unnecessarily adjusting. Nothing's going on. Just doing my job. Alex, we've been friends for 3 years. I can tell when something's eating at you. Finally, Alex set down his tools and looked directly at Michael. You want to know what's eating at me? Fine. I've been thinking about that night 6 months ago when we all talked about our 5-year plans. Remember what you said? Michael remembered. They'd all shared their hopes for their military careers, their dreams of advancement and achievement. Michael had talked about maybe pursuing leadership opportunities someday, but making it clear that he valued their brotherhood more than any promotion. You said you weren't interested in being an officer, Alex continued. You said you'd rather stay enlisted and keep working with the people you cared about. You made it sound like wanting more than that was somehow selling out. The accusation hung between them. Michael had said those things, and he'd meant them at the time. But circumstances had changed, opportunities had presented themselves, and he'd taken them. I wasn't lying, Michael said carefully. At the time, that's how I felt. But you changed your mind pretty quickly when Rodriguez started paying attention to you, Alex shot back. And the thing is, I don't even blame you for taking the opportunity. What bothers me is that you never once acknowledged that some of us might want the same opportunities. Alex stood up, his frustration finally boiling over. Do you know how many times I've watched you in briefings, seen the way officers listen to your ideas, watched you make suggestions that get implemented? Do you know how many times I've wanted to say I could do that too but couldn't because it would sound like sour grapes? Michael felt something shift inside him, not anger, but a recognition of how blind he'd been to his friend's perspective. Why didn't you apply for officer training yourself? Because by the time I realized I wanted to, you were already being groomed for it, Alex said. There's only so many slots available, Torres. We both know that. And, once you were being mentored by Patterson and getting FaceTime with Rodriguez, the rest of us became background noise. The truth of it was undeniable. Michael had received opportunities that weren't equally available to his friends, and he'd accepted them without considering how that might affect the group dynamic. You're right, Michael said simply. I should have talked to you about this earlier. I should have been more aware of how my path was affecting everyone else's opportunities. Alex sat back down, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, man. You earned those opportunities. But I need you to understand that from where I'm sitting, it looks like you got ahead by being everyone's friend, and now that you're ahead, you don't need the friendships the same way. The conversation continued for another hour, covering years of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings. By the end, they'd reached a kind of peace, but it was different from their old friendship. It was more honest but less comfortable, built on acknowledgement of their different paths rather than the assumption that those paths would always align. The next morning brought a crisis that would test everything Michael had learned about leadership. During a routine training exercise, Jake was injured when a piece of equipment malfunctioned. It wasn't life-threatening, but it required immediate medical attention and evacuation to the main base hospital. Lieutenant Patterson was off base for meetings, leaving Michael as the senior authority figure present. The decisions he made in the next few hours would affect not just Jake's recovery, but the mission timeline, resource allocation, and unit morale. The first decision was easy: get Jake the medical attention he needed. Michael coordinated the evacuation helicopter and ensured that Jake was stable and properly cared for. But the subsequent decisions were more complex. The unit was scheduled to begin a critical phase of training the next day, one that required full personnel complement. Jake's absence meant they were short-handed in a key technical role. Michael could delay the exercise, potentially affecting the entire deployment schedule, or he could redistribute responsibilities among the remaining team members. Danny volunteered to take on Jake's duties in addition to his own, but Michael knew that would overburden him and potentially compromise safety. Marcus could handle the technical aspects but was already stretched thin with his own assignments. Alex had the skills and the bandwidth, but taking on Jake's role would mean stepping away from his current responsibilities. The decision should have been purely tactical, based on capabilities and resource management. But Michael found himself thinking about his conversation with Alex the night before, about opportunities and advancement and the way leadership decisions affected individual careers. Giving Alex Jake's responsibilities would be beneficial for Alex professionally. It would showcase his versatility and leadership potential. But it would also look like favoritism, especially after their recent conversation. Not giving him the opportunity would be the safer choice professionally, but it might reinforce Alex's feeling that friendship no longer brought mutual benefit. In the end, Michael made the decision based purely on mission requirements. Alex was the best choice for Jake's role, regardless of their personal relationship. But he made sure to document his reasoning clearly and to discuss the decision with the remaining team members before implementing it. The next week tested all of them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Without Jake's steady presence, the group dynamic shifted. Danny's jokes seemed forced without Jake there to appreciate them. Marcus became more withdrawn without his usual partner for technical discussions. And Alex, while performing excellently in his expanded role, seemed to be holding himself apart from the others. Michael found himself managing not just the tactical aspects of their training, but the emotional landscape of a group dealing with change, stress, and uncertainty. It was exhausting in ways that pure military training had never been. The real test came when they received word that Jake's injury was more serious than initially thought. He would need surgery and an extended recovery period that would keep him off active duty for at least 6 months. The news hit the team hard, but it hit Michael differently than it hit the others. While his friends processed the news as a personal loss, Michael found himself immediately thinking about personnel replacement, mission continuity, and the administrative steps that would need to be taken. The realization that his first instinct was tactical rather than emotional was both disturbing and illuminating. That night, Danny confronted him about it. "You seemed pretty calm when we got the news about Jake," he said, his usual joking tone replaced by something sharper. "I'm worried about him too," Michael replied. "Are you?" "Because it looked like you were already figuring out how to replace him." The accusation was fair and unfair at the same time. Michael was concerned about Jake as a friend, but he was also responsible for mission success. The ability to think tactically in emotional situations was supposed to be a leadership strength, but it felt like a personal failure. "I have to think about both," Michael said finally. "Worrying about Jake doesn't help him get better. Making sure the mission continues honors his work while he recovers." "That sounds like something an officer would say," Danny replied, and walked away. The comment stayed with Michael for the rest of the deployment. His friends weren't wrong to notice that he was changing, but they also couldn't fully understand the pressures that were driving those changes. He was caught between two worlds, still enough of a peer to understand their perspectives, but enough of a leader to see beyond them. The final week of deployment brought both resolution and new questions. Jake's surgery was successful, and he was expected to make a full recovery. The unit completed their training objectives despite the personnel challenges. And Michael received official confirmation of his acceptance to officer candidate school. As they prepared to return to their home base, Alex approached him one last time. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Alex said. "I want you to know that I understand now why you got selected for officer training and I didn't. It's not just about leadership potential. It's about being able to carry the weight of being responsible for other people's lives and careers. I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet." It was a generous acknowledgement, but it also highlighted the isolation that came with leadership responsibility. Michael's friends could choose when to engage with the difficult aspects of command decisions. He was beginning to realize that he wouldn't have that luxury. The flight home was quiet. Danny slept most of the way. Marcus read technical manuals. Alex stared out the window. And Michael found himself thinking about the uniform he would soon wear, the rank he would carry, and the distance it would create between him and the people who had shaped him into someone worthy of that responsibility. The deployment had taught him that leadership wasn't just about making good decisions, it was about being willing to carry the full weight of those decisions alone, even when they affected the people you cared about most. It was a lesson that would serve him well in the challenges ahead, but it was also one that would change him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Officer Candidate School transformed Michael in ways that went far beyond military training. 12 weeks of intensive instruction in leadership, tactics, military law, and personnel management stripped away many of his assumptions about command and rebuilt them from the ground up. When he graduated and received his commission as a second lieutenant, he understood intellectually that he was a different person than the specialist Torres who had entered the program. But understanding it intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were vastly different things. The first shock came when he returned to his home base for his new assignment. He would be serving as a platoon leader in the same unit where he'd spent 3 years as an enlisted soldier, but everything had changed. The barracks he'd called home were now off limits except for official business. The NCO club where he'd spent countless evenings was replaced by the officers' club, where conversation focused on budgets and personnel evaluations rather than weekend plans and shared complaints about military bureaucracy. But the most jarring change was his first encounter with his old friends after returning from OCS. He'd arranged to meet them at their usual spot off base, hoping to reconnect and ease back into their friendship despite his new rank. What happened instead was a masterclass in how quickly relationships can shift when the fundamental balance of power changes. Danny was the first to see him approach, and his reaction set the tone for the entire evening. "Well, look who it is," he said, standing up with exaggerated formality. "Should we stand at attention, Lieutenant Torres?" The words were meant as a joke, but the edge in Danny's voice suggested deeper feelings. The others, Marcus, Alex, and, surprisingly, Jake, who had returned from medical leave the week before, all looked up with expressions that mixed genuine happiness at seeing him with uncertainty about how to interact with him now. "Come on, guys," Michael said, settling into his usual seat. "It's still me. The rank doesn't change anything between us. Doesn't it?" Alex asked quietly. It was the same question Jake had asked months before, but now it carried additional weight. They all knew the answer, even if none of them wanted to say it directly. The evening proceeded awkwardly, with conversations that kept hitting invisible barriers. When Marcus complained about their new squad leader, everyone looked at Michael expectantly, as if he should or could do something about it. When Danny made a joke about officers in general, he quickly added, "present company excluded, of course," which somehow made it worse than if he'd just let the comment stand. Jake, who had always been the most emotionally intelligent of the group, finally addressed the elephant in the room. "We're all dancing around this, but we need to talk about it. Mike, you're not just our friend anymore. You're also an officer. We can't pretend that doesn't complicate things." Michael wanted to argue, to insist that their friendship transcended military hierarchy, but Jake was right. Even in this casual setting, he found himself thinking like an officer, noting Marcus's complaint for potential follow-up, analyzing Danny's jokes for signs of deeper morale issues, evaluating Jake's recovery and readiness for full duty. "You're right," Michael said finally. "But I hope we can figure out how to navigate it. You guys mean too much to me to just walk away from our friendship." "Nobody's walking away," Alex assured him. "But we all need to acknowledge that things are different now. You've got responsibilities that we don't, and information that we don't, and authority that we don't. That's going to affect how we relate to each other." The evening ended earlier than their gatherings usually did, with promises to stay in touch and an unspoken understanding that future meetings would be rarer and more carefully managed. As Michael drove back to his new quarters in the officers' housing area, he felt the weight of isolation that would become his constant companion. His first week as a platoon leader brought practical lessons in how rank affected every aspect of his daily interactions. The soldiers in his platoon, none of whom he'd served with before, treated him with the careful respect reserved for new authority figures. They were professional and responsive, but there was a distance there that he hadn't experienced as an enlisted soldier. Even more challenging were his interactions with the NCOs who would be his primary partners in leading the platoon. Staff Sergeant Morrison, his platoon sergeant, was a career soldier with 15 years of experience who had worked with dozens of second lieutenants over the years. During their first private meeting, Morrison laid out the reality of their relationship with characteristic bluntness. "Sir, I'm going to give you the same speech I give all new lieutenants," Morrison said. "You have the rank and the authority, but I have the experience and the relationships. The soldiers respect the rank, but they'll follow the person. My job is to help you become someone worth following." It was a fair assessment and a generous offer, but it also highlighted how much Michael still had to learn. Over the following weeks, Morrison taught him the difference between giving orders and providing leadership, between being respected for his position and being respected for his competence. The real test came when Michael's platoon was assigned to work with his old unit on a training exercise. For the first time since his commissioning, he would be in a position of authority over soldiers he'd served alongside as a peer. The potential for awkwardness was enormous, but what actually happened was worse. It was professionally smooth and personally devastating. His former squadmates, now serving under different officers in the same company, treated him with perfect military courtesy. They addressed him as Sir, followed his instructions without question, and maintained the kind of professional demeanor that made clear they understood the boundaries. There were no jokes, no casual conversation, no acknowledgement of their shared history except in the carefully neutral way they might reference any previous assignment. Danny, in particular, seemed to have mastered the art of professional distance. When Michael gave his squad an assignment during the exercise, Danny responded with crisp efficiency, "Yes, sir. We'll have that completed by 1400 hours." The tone was respectful but impersonal, as if they were complete strangers rather than friends who had shared 3 years of experiences. It should have felt like a victory. His friends were demonstrating their professionalism and making his job easier by not putting him in the awkward position of managing personal relationships during official duties. Instead, it felt like a funeral for the friendship they'd once shared. The exercise concluded successfully, but afterward, when the soldiers were dismissed for liberty, Michael found himself hoping one of his old friends would approach him. Instead, they gathered in their usual cluster and headed off base without acknowledging him beyond the required military courtesies. That evening, Jake appeared at Michael's quarters, not in uniform, and clearly struggling with how to navigate their changed relationship. "Can we talk?" Jake asked. "Off the record, friend to friend?" Michael invited him in, grateful for any opportunity to reconnect with his old friendship group, but the conversation that followed illustrated just how complicated their new dynamic had become. "The guys wanted me to talk to you," Jake began. "We're all happy for your success, but we're also trying to figure out how to be around you now. Today during the exercise, when you gave us assignments, were you talking to us as Lieutenant Torres or as our friend Mike?" It was a fair question, but Michael realized he didn't have a clean answer. "Both, I guess. I'm still your friend, but I also have a job to do." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That's what we figured, and that's the problem. When you're wearing the uniform and giving orders, we can't respond to you as Mike. We have to respond to you as Lieutenant Torres. But we're never sure when you're wearing the uniform, metaphorically speaking." The insight was painful because it was accurate. Michael had been trying to maintain their friendship while establishing his authority as an officer, but those two goals were fundamentally incompatible in many situations. "What do you want from me?" Michael asked. "Clarity," Jake replied. "If we're friends, then we need times and places where we can be friends without the rank getting in the way. If we're not friends anymore, if the job makes that too complicated, then we need to accept that and move on. But this middle ground where we're pretending everything is the same when it obviously isn't, that's not working for anyone. Jake's visit forced Michael to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. His promotion had fundamentally altered every relationship from his previous life. Not because his friends resented his success, but because the responsibilities of leadership created inherent conflicts with the easy equality that friendship required. The next few months brought a series of incidents that illustrated these conflicts. When Marcus received a negative performance evaluation from his new squad leader, he asked Michael to intervene, not as a friend doing a favor, but as an officer who might have influence. When Danny got into disciplinary trouble for a minor infraction, other soldiers in the unit watched to see if Michael's personal relationship would affect the way the incident was handled. Most painfully, when their old squad leader, Corporal Peterson, was passed over for promotion to sergeant, he approached Michael with barely concealed bitterness. "Funny how things work out," Peterson said. 3 years ago, you were questioning my decisions in front of my soldiers. Now you're an officer and I'm still stuck at the same rank." The comment was unfair. Peterson's career struggles had nothing to do with Michael's advancement, but it highlighted how his promotion was being interpreted by some as a judgment on others' worth. Michael was succeeding in ways that made other people's lack of advancement more visible and painful. 6 months into his tenure as a platoon leader, Michael received orders for his next assignment. He would be taking over as company executive officer, second in command of the unit where he'd started his military career. It was a significant promotion and a vote of confidence in his leadership abilities, but it also meant he would be directly responsible for personnel decisions affecting his former friends. The night before the assignment change was announced, Alex visited him for the first time since he'd been commissioned. Their conversation was different from Jake's earlier visit, less emotional, more practical, but equally illuminating. "I wanted to talk to you before you take over as XO, Alex said. "I'm putting in for a transfer." Michael was surprised. Alex was a good soldier with a solid record, and transfers weren't easy to arrange. "Why? Is there a problem with your current assignment?" "The problem is that I can't serve effectively in a unit where my former peer is now my superior officer," Alex said bluntly. "It's not about resentment or jealousy. It's about the fact that our history makes it impossible for both of us to do our jobs properly." Alex went on to explain that other soldiers in the unit were constantly watching their interactions for signs of favoritism or bias. His own squad members questioned whether assignments were based on merit or friendship. And Alex himself found it difficult to maintain the proper respect for authority when that authority belonged to someone he'd once debated as an equal. "I'm not angry about your success," Alex continued. "But I can't pretend that your promotion doesn't affect my ability to do my job. A transfer is the best solution for both of us." The conversation ended with an acknowledgement that their friendship, while not ending, was entering a kind of suspension. They would always share the bond of their early military experiences, but they could no longer be active participants in each other's daily lives. A week later, when Michael put on his uniform for his first day as company executive officer, he understood in a way he never had before why the laughter had died in that locker room. The uniform didn't just represent authority, it represented separation. It meant being responsible for people he could no longer simply be friends with, making decisions that would affect lives without the comfort of shared perspectives, carrying burdens that couldn't be shared even with those who cared about him most. Standing in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting the rank insignia that marked him as someone in command, Michael realized that leadership wasn't about earning respect or proving competence. It was about accepting the isolation that came with responsibility and finding ways to lead effectively despite, or perhaps because of, that loneliness. The young man who had once been everyone's favorite teammate was gone, replaced by someone who would have to earn respect through different means and maintain relationships across barriers that couldn't be crossed. It was a necessary transformation, but as he prepared to face his first day in the new role, Michael wondered if the price of leadership was always this high, and whether the person he was becoming was worth the loss of the person he had been. 2 years later, Lieutenant Torres, now promoted to first lieutenant, stood in the same locker room where his transformation had begun, but this time he wasn't changing into his uniform. He was helping to clean it out after the unit's decommissioning, preparing for the soldiers' transfers to new assignments. The space that had once echoed with laughter now held only the quiet efficiency of men packing up years of shared memories. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd feared that putting on the uniform would end the laughter in this room, but ultimately it was military bureaucracy and reorganization that had silenced it permanently. The building would become storage space, the unit would be dissolved, and the men who had formed his foundational understanding of brotherhood would scatter across different bases and different lives. Danny was the first to leave, having been accepted for specialized training that would take him to the opposite coast. Their goodbye was awkward but genuine, both of them struggling to acknowledge how their relationship had evolved without dwelling on what they'd lost. "You turned out to be a good officer," Danny said, offering his hand rather than the casual embrace they might have shared years before. "I won't say I always agreed with your decisions, but I respected them." "That counts for something." It did count for something, though perhaps not in the way either of them had expected. Michael had learned that earning respect from former peers required proving himself worthy of authority rather than simply assuming it would be granted because of past friendship. Danny's acknowledgement was professional rather than personal, but it was sincere. Marcus transferred to a technical unit where his skills would be better utilized. His goodbye was characteristically practical, focused on logistics and contact information rather than emotional reflection. But, as he was leaving, he turned back with uncharacteristic directness. "You know, I never told you this, but watching you navigate the leadership transition taught me something important," Marcus said. "I used to think the hardest part of being promoted would be learning new responsibilities. But it's actually letting go of old relationships while building new ones. You handled that better than most people would have." Jake's departure was the most difficult. His injury had ultimately led to a medical discharge, and he was transitioning to civilian life with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Their final conversation took place in a coffee shop off base, the first time they'd met in civilian clothes since Michael's commission. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked. "Taking the commission, I mean. Giving up what we had for what you have now?" Michael had asked himself the same question countless times over the past 2 years. The honest answer was complicated. "I regret how it happened," he said finally. "I wish I'd been smarter about managing the transition, more aware of how it would affect everyone. But I don't regret the choice itself. I think I'm doing work that matters, and I think I'm good at it." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I think you are too. And I think our friendship is probably stronger now than it was before, even though we see each other less. When we were serving together, there was always this underlying competition, this sense that we were all fighting for the same opportunities. Now that you've found your path and I've found mine, we can just be happy for each other's success." It was a mature perspective, and one that gave Michael hope for maintaining meaningful relationships despite the changes in his life. Jake was right, their friendship had evolved rather than ended. It was different, more intentional, less casual, but perhaps more authentic because it was based on choice rather than circumstance. Alex's transfer had come 6 months earlier, and they'd had only limited contact since then. But he'd sent a letter when he heard about the unit decommissioning, and his words had stayed with Michael: "Leadership is lonely, but it doesn't have to be isolating. The key is learning when to be Lieutenant Torres and when to be Mike, and making sure both versions of yourself get what they need." The insight had proven crucial in Michael's development as an officer. He'd learned to compartmentalize his roles, creating space for authentic relationships outside of his professional responsibilities while maintaining appropriate boundaries within them. It wasn't the easy camaraderie he'd once known, but it was sustainable in ways that his earlier attempts at friendship plus authority had not been. His relationship with Staff Sergeant Morrison had evolved into something Michael hadn't expected: a mentorship that went both ways. Morrison taught him practical leadership skills, while Michael brought fresh perspectives on training and personnel development. Their professional partnership had gradually developed into something approaching friendship, though it was friendship defined by mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than shared history. "You've learned the most important lesson about leadership," Morrison told him during one of their weekly planning sessions. "It's not about being liked or being feared. It's about being trusted. The soldiers trust that you'll make decisions based on what's best for the mission and for them, not on what's easiest for you personally. That trust had been hard-earned. Michael's first year as executive officer had included several painful decisions that had tested his commitment to professional standards over personal relationships. He'd had to recommend disciplinary action against soldiers he genuinely liked, deny requests that would have benefited individuals but compromised unit readiness, and maintain professional distance when what he wanted was to offer personal support. The most challenging test had come when one of his former squad mates, a soldier who had served under a different leader but whom Michael had known well, had requested a transfer to Michael's company. The soldier was competent and would have been a valuable addition, but Michael had denied the request because he recognized that their previous relationship would create the same complications he'd worked so hard to overcome with his original friend group. The decision had been professionally sound but personally difficult. It had also established his credibility with both his superiors and his subordinates, demonstrating that he could put mission requirements ahead of personal preferences. As he finished clearing out his old locker, Michael reflected on what he'd learned about leadership and friendship over the past 2 years. The military had taught him that effective authority required distance, but experience had taught him that the distance didn't have to be permanent or total. Relationships could evolve, boundaries could be negotiated, and respect could be maintained across different levels of hierarchy. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source, Corporal Peterson, his old squad leader who had struggled with Michael's rapid advancement. The message was brief but significant. "Congratulations on your promotion to first lieutenant. You've earned it." It was a small gesture, but one that represented something important. Peterson had found a way to acknowledge Michael's success without diminishing his own worth. It had taken 2 years, but they'd both learned that leadership advancement wasn't a zero-sum game where one person's success required another's failure. Michael's new assignment would take him to a different base, where he would serve as a company commander for the first time. It was another significant promotion, with greater responsibilities and greater challenges. It would also be his first assignment where none of his subordinates would have prior history with him, where he could establish his leadership style without the complications of past relationships. But he would take with him the lessons learned from the transformation that had begun in this locker room. He understood now that leadership required sacrifice, but not necessarily the complete sacrifice of personal relationships. It required boundaries, but not walls. It required professional distance, but not emotional detachment. Most importantly, he'd learned that the laughter in the locker room hadn't really died when he put on the uniform. It had simply moved to different spaces, taken different forms, and included different people. The easy camaraderie of his early military years had been replaced by more complex but equally meaningful relationships built on professional respect, shared responsibility, and mutual trust. As he walked out of the locker room for the last time, Michael thought about the young soldier who had worried that leadership would isolate him from the people he cared about. That soldier hadn't been wrong, exactly, but he'd been incomplete in his understanding. Leadership did create distance, but it also created opportunities for different kinds of connection. It did end certain relationships, but it also deepened others and made possible new ones that couldn't have existed without the authority and responsibility that came with rank. The uniform had changed everything, but perhaps not in the way he'd feared. It had changed him from someone who was universally liked to someone who was selectively trusted. It had changed his friendships from casual partnerships to intentional connections. And it had changed his understanding of what it meant to be responsible for other people's welfare and development. Standing outside the building that had housed so many formative experiences, Michael realized that the transformation was ongoing. Each new assignment would bring new challenges, new relationships to navigate, new lessons about the balance between authority and humanity. The young man who had feared losing his friends to his ambitions had become someone who understood that the best leaders don't choose between professional success and personal connection, they find ways to honor both. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Jake. "Heard about your promotion to company commander. Remember us little people when you're a general." Michael smiled as he typed his response. "I'll try to fit you into my busy schedule of important meetings and golf games." It was the kind of easy banter they'd shared years before, but now it carried the weight of mutual respect and the distance of different life paths. It was friendship evolved rather than friendship lost, and that evolution had made both of them better people. As he drove away from the base for the last time, Michael thought about the soldiers he would soon be responsible for leading. They would be strangers at first, but over time some might become friends, others might become mentors, and all would become part of his ongoing education in the complex art of leadership. The uniform he wore represented authority, but the man inside it had learned that true leadership came from understanding when to exercise that authority and when to simply be present as one human being supporting another. It had taken 2 years and the loss of several important relationships to learn that lesson, but as he headed toward his new assignment and new challenges, Michael finally understood that the price of leadership wasn't the loss of connection, it was the willingness to form connections in new ways, with new people, under new circumstances. The laughter in the locker room had ended, but somewhere else, in a different place with different people, new laughter was beginning. And, this time, Lieutenant Torres understood his role in both fostering it and knowing when to step outside it, letting others find their own ways to connect while he carried the larger responsibility of ensuring they had the opportunity to do so safely and successfully. That understanding, more than any uniform or rank, was what finally made him a leader worth following.